Hello from the Sir Jack Lyons Concert Hall at the University of York, and a very big welcome to this introduction to the elementary and preparatory exercises from the Method of Methods of Moscheles and Fétis. This is probably the least known part of the method. The method is famous because of the Études de perfectionnement, in particular the contribution from Chopin, but we'll talk more about the other composers involved at that in a later video. For today, I want to talk about these elementary exercises, which were, I suppose, a cradle-to-grave introduction to playing the piano. So we begin with simple five-finger melodies that are played as a duet with the teacher, and moving on to some really very, very advanced and difficult piano writing that would give you all of the tools that you would need to play the most virtuosic music of the 19th century, and also tell us a thing or two about what virtuosity meant in the 19th century, because it's not always the same as our understanding of it today. So, to begin, exercise 1, the student would learn to play with one hand only, a melody that's played only in five-finger position and in C major. The fingering is given so that it can be played with both hands. So we can suppose that it was Moscheles' intention that the student would learn to play it with one hand and then with the other hand. This is a theme and variations. The piano accompaniment to be played by the teacher begins quite simply. Variation 1 has a couple more notes in the melody. With a slightly more interesting piano part. Variation 2 introduces a rhythmic complication. The student learns how to perform syncopations. And will also observe their teacher playing some faster note values. So a few little twiddles put in the piano part. The third variation has some faster note values for the student, with a bass as a moto proprio, and the last one marks cantabile, with a rather charming accompaniment from the teacher. So from the very onset, the student will be playing what feels like real music. Not what feels like real music, it is real music. And all the time there are these footnotes underneath saying the following exercises were composed by Monsieur Moscheles specifically for this method and only for this method. You then go on to another set of variations which are in the relative minor, in A minor, which introduces some more rapid playing from the student. Sorry, the D's not working. I'll play that an octave up. And then some more complicated rhythms. And a more complex accompaniment from the teacher as well. Then the third set of variations has a rather hymn-like tune, which is followed by a variation in triplets. And then semiquavers, with again a more elaborate accompaniment in the piano part. These are followed by some really very, very simple finger exercises, where the student simply plays 1, 5, 1, 5, then versions of the 1 to 5 scale up and down, beginning. Then doubling the note value. Doubling it again. Faster and faster. Now, what's really interesting about this particular exercise is whilst the student part is kind of pretty uninteresting, let's face it, he gives a a staff for the teacher on either side of the student's part, so that they would play first of all with their teacher in duet playing above them with a counter melody. I'll play the beginning, I'll play both parts together. And then later on, the piano teacher would move to the left-hand side of the student and play extra notes in the bass. Principle that this shows us is that the student learns from the example of the teacher. The part that the teacher plays becomes increasingly more elaborate, even contrapuntal, toward the end of it. With more elaborate harmonies winding around it, and the same with one in the bass, so that the student can play something relatively simple whilst looking at what the teacher's doing. And I think what this also does is develop a sense of proprioception at the keyboard. So they become familiar with the sound of the high notes and the low notes while they're based in the middle of the keyboard. So I think that's quite a clever device. There's another exercise that does this even more elaborately. And then you get your first real piece of music, which is a rondino. It's absolutely gorgeous. So the rondino for 4 hands, and the student plays the melody parts, which stays mostly in, well, entirely in 5-finger position. And so on, and it's only in the middle section where you move to a different 5-finger hand position. And in it you have all sorts of different rhythms, articulations, marks of expression to explore, and it really is the most glorious little piece. And then after that, after all of the things that are done in duets with the teacher, I think it's like learning to ride a bicycle where you have stabilizers. Then the stabilizers come off, and you have a series of pieces, again sets of variations on a simple theme, where the student has to learn how to use the hands independently. Second exercise, an actual piece of music. So it's a very old piano, we're 150 years old, and sometimes she likes to complain to me, so D isn't working brilliantly today. And then go on to number 3, which is where you start extending the 5-finger position and learning how to use the left hand in a more elaborate accompanimental role. So you have a melody, first of all, it's a piece for the 6 touches. So you'll be able to have a gap between the thumb and second finger of a third rather than a second. And we're in the key of F major, which has 1 flat. The second one's in the key of G major, which has 1 sharp. And the third one is in the key of D major, which has 2 sharps. So increasingly he's introducing black keys as well. So and they're very charming. Then the next one is an introduction to preparation for arpeggios. So we go from the 6 notes through to the 7 notes, and then through to the full arpeggio. Going straight on from there, he starts introducing double notes. And this is very interesting to me, because usually double notes are considered a crowning glory of virtuosity for the pianist, and certainly wouldn't be typically approached right at the beginning of somebody's instruction. So fairly early on, and he very frequently writes for accents to be played with the weaker fingers. And what we know from Henselt's exercises, he talks about playing accents with the finger rather than the arm, which he describes as the enemy of great piano execution. So the arm shouldn't be used on the accents, the fingers. And what these also do is provide a template for how to practice thirds or passages in general with alternating accents and stuff like that. So you learn a lot about how he would have expected his students to practice. Number 3 is like a little tiny intermezzo, absolutely exquisite music. This is for playing double notes where the second finger passes over the thumb. So instead of this fingering, it's this fingering. Delightful minuet, which is a massively more complicated exercise in thirds, and he introduces chromatic thirds. And then in the left hand. Then there's sort of a gap, and we become immediately vastly more virtuosic, and we have exercise for extension of the hand, and what you have to do is play rapid notes with the fingers in the middle of the hand, and then expand the extremity. Quite difficult to do, actually. And we are going into all sorts of exotic keys, G flat major. Stretching the hand beyond the octave. So this is no longer a beginner's exercise. We're now into the area of the preparatory exercises. The next one is written to be played dans le style, in the smooth style, and it's written with fingerings which suggest that he would prefer the pedal to be used very, very little, if at all. He's gone to great pains to write fingerings that can be played strictly legato with the with the fingers alone. So, for example, a finger substitution on both. Then he introduces, he calls it morceau expressif for the cadence, for the turn. Again, with the footnote saying that this andantino is composed expressly for this method. That's followed by an exercise by Czerny in how to play turns very, very rapidly. And it is true, if you can play that then it really isn't very difficult to play the Moscheles piece that precedes it. Then we have an exercise in very rapid repetition. And we have to remember this type of piano, the Erard, and Moscheles owned one, was the instrument that patented the double escapement action, enabling a piano with a greater key depth to repeat without the key coming all the way back up to the surface. So in both hands. Then both hands together. So that little piece. Then he goes to Kramer, and Kramer is fairly omnipresent. He's often mentioned in the 19th century. Beethoven was a big fan of Kramer and his instructional piano music. So we have an exercise in scale grouping. So this isn't, it's like a section of a scale, starting with the second finger and the thumb underneath. Then the other direction, descending scale. So you have the scales that develop. So you have something that's of musical interest but also very instructional. So that scales within a limited position, followed by a short exercise by Moscheles, which has scales that go further, so scales that go beyond the sixth or the octave. And then we have another Kramer exercise, mostly in broken thirds. Then he goes on to double notes again, thirds, but this time a bit more elaborately. And he doesn't abandon the left hand entirely, where there's a recap of the main theme, the left hand takes over some of the hard work. So you have a few, and then a very treacherous passage. That's a horrible tongue twister for the fingers. Then from Kessler. Kessler was the dedicatee of Chopin's 24 Preludes. He operated in Poland for some time, and his etudes were much admired and really quite difficult. So then we have Marx alla Capriccio, etude in octaves, which is basically a two-part invention, played in octaves. For about 4 pages, it's quite tiring. Then, intriguingly, we have, written by Moscheles, a canon at the 7th. And the canon at the 7th is a double canon, so it's played in thirds in both hands, mostly. What's interesting about it is that the left hand is written entirely in the alto clef. So it is both an exercise in learned counterpoint and clef reading, which I think at that time was considered quite an important skill for keyboard players, and it would enable you to read through a string quartet score, for example, or read the string section from an orchestra. And so on. And then to complete this volume, we have 2 pieces of music by what would have been considered ancient composers. We have a sonata by Domenico Scarlatti. In one of the volumes it's called a toccata. In this edition it's called an etude. And it deals with a couple of things that aren't really touched anywhere else in the method. You have repeated notes with one finger. So you think of... And it also deals with rapid sixths. You have a few scales in sixths in this piece, and that again is something that doesn't really appear anywhere else in the method. And intriguingly, to finish with, you have a prelude and a fugue by Bach, just the one. And the edition he uses, I presume it's his own edition, is modelled quite closely on the Czerny edition, which had been published by Edition Peters as the first Edition Peters release in 1800. And Czerny had studied them with Beethoven, so it's considered that he was handing on to the next generation what he had learned from Beethoven. And what we see in the method is there's a section where it talks about articulation, and where you have arpeggiated passages we should overhold. So he says, figurations like this shouldn't be played dry, they should be overheld with the fingers. And adjacent note scales should not. So with this prelude, I'm wondering if it's been selected for that reason, because you have both the option to overhold the arpeggio passages, and then a mixture. Adjacent tones to play them separated, and wherever you have the arpeggios to play them overheld. And that fugue, with a fingering that suggests that he wants it played on the note rather than above the note. All of the trills are fingered to be played on the note. And that is the conclusion of that volume of the Method of Methods. A thing that I find really interesting about it is that toward the end of this volume, with the octave study that goes on for 4 pages, the pianist has to display a tremendous degree of virtuosity, and there are very few pieces in the concert etudes at the end which exhibit such fearsome virtuosity. The Liszt one does, for sure, but rather it's that you have to have the capability to play things like this in order to be able to play the concert etudes with ease. So I think this is all about developing a technique that is so advanced that nothing is going to give you a difficulty, so that you can play the piano with ease and relaxation. And that feeds, I think, into the idea that Moscheles gives us with the titles of his first 2 etudes, Enjoyment and Ambition.